September 12, 1944. Camp Huntsville, Texas. The transport truck lurched to a stop outside a compound that looked nothing like the prison camps Liesl Bachmann had imagined during the long journey across the Atlantic. No barbed wire towers looming against threatening skies. No guards with snarling dogs. Instead, a modest facility with whitewashed barracks sat beneath the sprawling Texas sun, surrounded by fencing that seemed almost apologetic in its presence. 43 German women climbed down from the vehicle, their gray auxiliary uniforms dusty and wrinkled from weeks of travel. They moved with the careful dignity of soldiers who refused to show weakness, even in defeat. Liesl clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she still owned in the world: a change of underclothes, a wooden comb, a single photograph of her family in Munich, taken before the war when her brothers still smiled easily and her mother's eyes held no shadows. She had been captured in France 3 months earlier while working as an administrative clerk for a Wehrmacht supply depot. The Allies had swept through so quickly that evacuation became impossible. One moment she was filing requisition forms. The next, American soldiers were standing in her office doorway. Captain Ruth Jennings stood waiting as the women formed an uncertain line. She was older than Liesl expected, with gray threading through her brown hair and lines around her eyes that suggested more compassion than cruelty. The captain's uniform was crisp despite the heat, and she held herself with quiet authority that commanded respect without demanding fear. "Welcome to Camp Huntsville," Captain Jennings said in clear English that Liesl barely understood. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will be provided housing, food, medical care, and work assignments. You will be treated humanely." Liesl caught only fragments of the speech, but the tone conveyed more than the words. This was not the voice of someone preparing to extract revenge. Beside her, Marguerite Fischer whispered a rough translation in German. "They say they will feed us, give us medical care." Marga's voice carried disbelief. Her blue eyes, hollow from months of reduced rations in occupied France, narrowed with suspicion. The women were led to their barracks, a long wooden structure with rows of simple cots, clean blankets folded at the foot of each bed, a small window above every sleeping space. Helene Weber, the senior nurse among them, ran her hand along one of the blankets and looked up with confusion. "These are new," she said quietly in German. "Not torn, not threadbare." That evening, as the September heat finally broke, the women sat in small clusters on their cots, speaking in hushed German about what their captivity might hold. They had heard stories of American prison camps. Some said the Americans were soft, that they treated prisoners better than their own soldiers. Others warned of hard labor and deliberate starvation disguised as rationing. Liesl wrote nothing in the small diary she kept hidden. There were no words yet for what she was feeling. Only questions that had no answers. Only uncertainty stretching forward like an endless road. The memories of hunger were still fresh in their bodies. Not the desperate starvation of concentration camps, but the grinding, daily reduction of rations that had defined the final years of the war in Germany. Liesl remembered the careful calculations her mother had made each week, dividing their allotted bread into ever thinner slices. The way soup became more water than substance. How her younger sister had stopped menstruating because her body no longer had enough fat to sustain normal functions. In France, working for the Wehrmacht, rations had been better but still carefully controlled. Everything was accounted for, measured, distributed according to strict formulas designed to keep soldiers functioning but never satisfied. Liesl had grown accustomed to the constant low-level gnawing in her stomach, the way her hip bones had become sharp angles beneath her uniform, the hollowness in her cheeks that made her look older than her 24 years. The other women carried similar stories in their bodies. Frida Klein, at 19, had the translucent skin and brittle hair of someone who had spent her teenage years undernourished. Marga had confessed one night in France that she sometimes dreamed about butter, real butter, the way other girls dreamed about boys. The war had taught them all to think constantly about food, to calculate calories instinctively, to never waste even the smallest crumb. So when Sergeant William Patterson appeared at their barracks door on that first evening and announced in his slow Texas drawl that dinner would be served in the mess hall, the women approached with cautious expectations. They had been fed on the transport ship gray meals of watery stew and hard bread that met the minimum requirements of the Geneva Convention. They expected more of the same. Survival rations. Enough to keep them working. Nothing more. The mess hall was a separate building, larger than their barracks, with long tables and benches arranged in neat rows. The smell hit them first. Something rich and savory that made Liesel's stomach clench with sudden, painful hunger. Helene Weber stopped so abruptly in the doorway that Anneliese Vogt bumped into her from behind. "That smells like real meat," Helene whispered in German, her voice carrying confusion rather than joy. They filed through a serving line, each woman handed a metal tray, divided into sections. Private Eddie Rossi, a young soldier with dark hair and an easy smile, stood behind the steam tables ladling food onto their trays. Liesel watched in disbelief as he placed a thick slice of meatloaf onto her tray, then added a generous scoop of mashed potatoes, green beans glistening with butter, a slice of white bread, and a small dish of what appeared to be apple sauce. The portions were not huge, but they were substantial. Real food. Food that smelled of abundance, rather than desperation. Liesel carried her tray to a table, sat down, and stared at the meal before her. Around her, the other women were doing the same, their faces reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and suspicion that she felt tightening in her own chest. They ate that first meal in near silence, forks moving slowly, carefully, as if the food might disappear if they acknowledged it too eagerly. Liesel cut her meatloaf into small pieces, chewing each bite thoroughly, trying to make it last. The taste was almost overwhelming after months of bland rations. Salt, pepper, herbs she couldn't identify. The mashed potatoes were creamy and rich, nothing like the watery substitutes she had eaten in Germany. Across the table, Frida had tears running down her cheeks as she ate, though whether from relief or shame, Liesel couldn't tell. Marga ate mechanically, her face carefully blank, refusing to show any emotion that might be interpreted as gratitude. Helene ate with the practiced efficiency of a nurse who had learned to consume meals quickly between emergencies, but her eyes kept darting toward the serving line, as if trying to understand the logic behind such generosity. The first week passed in a blur of adjustment and confusion. They were assigned work details. Light duties mostly, laundry, kitchen assistance, cleaning. The guards were neither cruel nor particularly friendly, maintaining professional distance while treating them with basic courtesy. Captain Jennings conducted daily inspections, her standards high but her manner fair. The routine was almost disappointing in its normalcy, but it was the food that continued to unsettle them. Every meal came with portions that seemed impossibly generous by German standards. Breakfast brought oatmeal with brown sugar, scrambled eggs, toast with margarine. Lunch offered sandwiches made with actual meat, fruit that wasn't bruised or rotting, milk that tasted fresh and cold. Dinner always included protein, vegetables, bread, and occasionally dessert. Simple puddings or canned fruit that the American soldiers seemed to regard as unremarkable, but which left the German women stunned. On their first Sunday in camp, September 17th, something different happened. The women filed into the mess hall for their midday meal, expecting the usual fare. Instead, Sergeant Patterson stood at the front of the serving line with an expression that suggested he was particularly pleased about something. Private Rossi was grinning as he arranged plates rather than using the usual trays. Liesel reached the front of the line and stopped. On the plate Rossi handed her sat a slice of chocolate cake. Not a sliver. A genuine slice, 3 layers high with rich frosting between each layer and coating the outside. Beside it sat the regular meal, but the cake dominated her vision. She stared at it, unable to move, until the women behind her began to press forward. She carried the plate to her table in a daze. Around her, the other women were equally frozen, staring at their plates as if they contained something dangerous rather than delicious. Marga was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "This must be a mistake." Helene shook her head slowly. "Or a test." Annalise looked toward the American soldiers, eating at their own tables, trying to see if they too had received cake. They didn't eat the cake immediately. The 43 women sat before their plates, forks untouched, engaging in a silent standoff with dessert. Liesl watched as Private Rossi carried his own plate to the American soldiers' table, sat down, and immediately cut into an identical slice of chocolate cake. He ate it without ceremony, without even seeming to notice what he was consuming, chatting with the soldier beside him about something that made them both laugh. "It's real," Frida whispered in German. "They're eating it too." But Marga remained unconvinced. "Perhaps they want to see if we'll take it, if we'll show weakness." Helene, always practical, pointed out that refusing food made no logical sense. "If they're offering it, we should eat it. We need the calories." But even she made no move toward her fork. Liesl finally picked up her utensil, the metal cool and solid in her hand. She cut a small piece from the corner of the cake, the fork sliding easily through the soft layers. The frosting was smooth, dark, unmistakably chocolate. She lifted it to her mouth and placed it on her tongue. The sweetness exploded across her taste buds with an intensity that made her close her eyes. Rich, dense, moist. Real chocolate, not the ersatz substitutes made from acorns and chicory that had become standard in Germany. Around her, other women began to eat, their initial resistance crumbling in the face of temptation and hunger. Some ate quickly, almost desperately, as if the cake might be snatched away. Others took tiny bites, trying to make each morsel last. Frida ate with her eyes closed, silent tears continuing to stream down her face. Annalise ate with fierce concentration, her jaw tight, as if angry at herself for wanting something from their captors. That night in the barracks, the whispered conversations took on a different tone. "What does it mean, this cake?" Marga asked the darkness. "Why would they give us such things?" Liesl lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what she knew about war with what she was experiencing. In Germany, they had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, wasteful, that their abundance made them weak. But what did it mean when that abundance extended even to enemies? Perhaps it's propaganda. Someone suggested from across the room. They want us to write home about how well we're treated. But Helene's voice cut through the speculation with uncomfortable truth. Most of us can't write home. The mail system is destroyed. Our families don't even know if we're alive. So who would the propaganda be for? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Liesl thought about the chocolate cake, about the way it had tasted like childhood birthdays and Christmas mornings, like a world before rationing and sacrifice and constant hunger. She thought about Private Rossi's casual consumption of the same dessert, how unremarkable it had been for him. What kind of country had so much that chocolate cake on Sunday was simply ordinary? The second Sunday brought cake again, and the third, and the fourth. What had initially seemed like an incomprehensible anomaly gradually revealed itself to be routine. Every Sunday, without fail, dessert appeared on their plates. Sometimes chocolate cake, sometimes vanilla with strawberry frosting, occasionally apple pie or rice pudding. The American soldiers ate the same desserts with the same casual indifference, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Liesl found herself assigned to kitchen duty in early October, working under Sergeant Patterson's supervision. He was a big man with weathered hands and a slow, patient manner that reminded her of her grandfather. Patterson spoke rarely, but when he did, his words carried weight. On her first morning peeling potatoes alongside Marga and Annalise, he demonstrated the proper technique, then left them to work, checking periodically but never hovering or criticizing unnecessarily. The kitchen revealed secrets that the mess hall had only hinted at. Liesl watched in amazement as Patterson inventoried supplies. Sacks of flour stacked higher than her head, cases of canned vegetables, boxes of sugar that seemed impossibly abundant, barrels of cooking oil, great hanging sides of beef in the cold storage, and in a separate pantry, baking supplies, chocolate bars, vanilla extract, bags of cocoa powder. Everything needed to create the Sunday desserts that had become both comfort and confusion. One morning, as Liesl stirred a massive pot of oatmeal, Patterson approached with a clipboard. He spoke in his slow English, and though she understood only fragments, his gestures made his meaning clear. He was asking if she knew how to bake. Liesel nodded hesitantly. Her mother had taught her basic recipes before the war, though ingredients had become too scarce to practice much after 1941. Patterson's face brightened. He disappeared into the pantry and returned with ingredients: flour, eggs, milk, sugar, butter. Real butter, golden and rich, not the gray margarine that had become Germany's substitute. He set everything on the work counter and made a stirring motion, then pointed at the oven. He wanted her to bake something. Anything. A test of her skills. Liesel's hands trembled as she measured ingredients. Marga and Anneliese had stopped their own work to watch. She mixed a simple butter cake, the recipe emerging from memory like a song, from childhood. Patterson observed without interfering, occasionally nodding approval at her technique. When she slid the pan into the oven, he checked the temperature and made a small adjustment, then gave her a thumbs-up gesture that needed no translation. 45 minutes later, the cake emerged golden and fragrant. Patterson cut a slice while it was still warm, tasted it, and smiled broadly. "Good," he said clearly. "Very good." Then he did something unexpected. He cut 2 more slices and handed them to Marga and Anneliese. Finally, he cut a piece for Liesel herself, not as a ration, not as a reward, simply as a baker sharing her creation. The gesture was so simple, so human, that Liesel felt something crack inside her chest. Private Eddie Rossi became their unlikely translator. His Italian grandmother had spoken broken English mixed with Italian phrases, teaching him patience with language barriers. He started bringing a small notebook to the kitchen, writing down words in English, with crude phonetic pronunciations beneath: flour, egg, mix, bake, simple kitchen vocabulary that created bridges between German and American women working side by side. Liesel discovered she had an aptitude for English that surprised her. Words stuck in her memory after hearing them only once or twice. Within weeks, she could follow basic conversations, though speaking remained difficult. Her tongue stumbled over unfamiliar sounds, and she felt self-conscious about her heavy accent. But Rossi never laughed or showed impatience. He simply repeated words slowly, exaggerating his mouth movements so she could see how sounds were formed. The kitchen became a strange classroom where recipes served as curriculum. Patterson would announce the day's menu, and Liesel would translate for the other German women on kitchen duty. They learned words through necessity and repetition: chop, stir, simmer, drain, season. Each task came with its English label, building vocabulary one meal at a time. Marga proved quick with numbers, easily converting American measurements. Anneliese had perfect timing instincts, somehow knowing exactly when bread needed to come out of the oven. But it was the informal moments that taught them most about American culture. One afternoon, Sergeant Patterson brought his personal radio to the kitchen, tuning it to a music station while they worked. Swing music poured out, big band sounds that were both foreign and infectious. Rossi began moving his shoulders to the rhythm as he kneaded dough, unconsciously dancing while he worked. Liesel watched, fascinated by how unself-conscious he was, how the music seemed to live in his body. Back home, such frivolity during work hours would have been unthinkable. Efficiency and seriousness were virtues. Joy was something reserved for appropriate times and places, carefully controlled and rationed like everything else. But here, Patterson didn't reprimand Rossi for dancing. He simply smiled and turned the volume up, slightly. Work and pleasure weren't enemies in this strange American kitchen. They coexisted naturally, woven together like ingredients in a recipe. The language lessons extended beyond vocabulary. Liesel learned that Americans asked questions constantly. How are you? Did you sleep well? Is that too heavy? Do you need help? Questions that seemed to expect honest answers rather than formulaic responses. At first, she found it intrusive, this constant inquiry into her state of being, but gradually she understood it differently. These weren't interrogations. They were expressions of concern, casual acknowledgments of her humanity. She learned that Americans smiled at strangers, made jokes during serious work, and said thank you for the smallest actions. Patterson thanked her every time she handed him a measuring cup. Rossi said please before asking her to pass ingredients. These tiny courtesies, so automatic they seemed unconscious, were performed regardless of her status as prisoner. The words cost nothing, yet they accumulated into something that felt dangerously close to respect. In November, Captain Jennings announced that the Red Cross had established a limited mail system for prisoner correspondence. Each woman would be allowed to write one letter per month to family in Germany, subject to censorship. The letters would be collected, reviewed, and sent through neutral channels, though delivery was uncertain given the chaos of war. No one could promise when or if the letters would arrive. Liesl sat in the barracks with a single sheet of paper before her, a pencil in her hand, and no idea what to write. How could she explain her current existence to her mother? How could she describe meals that would sound like fantasy to people eating turnip soup and black bread? She imagined her mother reading about chocolate cake on Sundays and dismissing it as lies designed to make captivity sound more bearable than it was. Around her, other women struggled with the same impossible task. Marga had written and crossed out 3 different opening lines, each attempt feeling inadequate. Helene sat with her pencil hovering above blank paper, frozen by the weight of months of silence. Frida was crying quietly, her letter already tear-stained and smudged. How did you summarize survival to people who might not have survived themselves? Liesl finally began writing, choosing her words carefully. Dear Mama, I am alive and well. I am being held in a prisoner camp in America, in a place called Texas. We are treated according to international law. We have sufficient food and clean housing. I am healthy. I think of you and Papa and Heinrich and little Marie every day. She paused, reading what she had written. It was truthful but incomplete. The absence of suffering would itself seem suspicious. She added carefully, the Americans provide us with work assignments in the kitchen. The food here is different from home. They have supplies we have not seen in years. This seems safer than describing actual meals. Let her mother imagine what that meant without providing details that would seem unbelievable. She finished with, I pray this letter finds you safe. I pray the war ends soon and we can be reunited. Your loving daughter Liesl. The letter felt inadequate, a pale sketch of her actual experience. She had said nothing about Patterson's patient teaching or Rossi's language lessons. Nothing about the strange courtesy of American guards or the confusion of being treated humanely by enemies. Nothing about how captivity was forcing her to question everything she had believed about the war and her place in it. These truths were too complex for a single page of censored mail. Captain Jennings collected the letters personally, reading each one carefully before placing them in an envelope marked for Red Cross transport. When she reached Liesl's letter, she paused, looking up to meet Liesl's eyes directly. This will be sent, she said, in slow, clear English. I hope your family receives it safely. The kindness in her voice was almost harder to bear than cruelty would have been. Liesl nodded, unable to trust herself to speak without her voice breaking. The guilt arrived gradually, like winter cold seeping through inadequate walls. It started the Sunday after they had mailed their letters home. Liesl sat before her plate with its generous slice of lemon cake, and suddenly she could see her mother's face superimposed over the dessert. Her mother, who had given her own portions to Liesl's younger siblings countless times. Her mother, who had probably not tasted real sugar in years. She forced herself to eat the cake anyway, but it sat heavy in her stomach, less like food and more like evidence of betrayal. Around her, she noticed similar expressions on other faces. Marga ate her dessert mechanically, staring at nothing. Frida pushed hers around her plate, taking tiny bites that seemed more like penance than pleasure. Even Helene, usually so pragmatic, ate with visible discomfort. That night, Anneliese spoke what many were thinking. How can we eat like this when our families are starving? Her voice in the darkness carried an edge of accusation, though whether directed at their captors or themselves remained unclear. We didn't ask for this, Marga responded, but her tone lacked conviction. Helene, always the voice of reason, tried to redirect their thinking. Refusing food won't feed your families. Starving ourselves serves no one. But logic couldn't touch the emotional truth. They were prisoners eating better than they had as free citizens. Their enemies were feeding them more generously than their own government had. Every meal became a reminder of this fundamental wrongness, this reversal of everything they had been taught about sacrifice and duty. In Germany, virtue meant going without so that soldiers at the front could have more. Here, abundance was simply expected, taken for granted, extended even to prisoners. Liesel found herself eating more slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly, trying to feel appropriately grateful rather than appropriately guilty. She began leaving small portions on her plate, not enough to waste food, but enough to feel like she wasn't indulging completely. Other women adopted similar habits, taking slightly smaller servings, declining second helpings, creating invisible rations where none existed. Sergeant Patterson noticed. He approached Liesel one morning in the kitchen, his weathered face concerned. "You sick?" He gestured to his stomach, then to her. "Not eating enough." Liesel struggled to find English words to explain. "Not sick," she managed finally. She searched her limited vocabulary for the right word and couldn't find it. She made a gesture toward her heart, a helpless movement that tried to convey emotional rather than physical discomfort. Patterson studied her for a long moment, then said something she didn't fully understand, but whose tone conveyed sympathy. He disappeared and returned with a piece of paper, drawing simple pictures while speaking slowly. He drew a plate of food, then drew an arrow to a stick figure representing Liesel, then drew that figure strong and healthy. His message was clear. Eating kept her alive and healthy. That mattered. But what he couldn't understand, what her limited English couldn't explain, was that staying healthy on enemy food felt like its own form of defeat. December brought cooler weather to Texas, though nothing like the bitter cold Liesel remembered from German winters. Working in the kitchen had become routine, her hands moving through familiar tasks, while her mind wandered. She had been assigned to wash vegetables one morning, standing at the large sink near a window that overlooked the camp's delivery area. Outside, a supply truck was being unloaded. Liesel watched as Private Rossi and two other soldiers carried crate after crate into the storage building. The sheer volume was staggering. She counted 20 crates of what appeared to be canned goods, 15 sacks of flour, 8 large containers marked as sugar, 10 boxes she couldn't identify. The truck wasn't even half empty when she stopped counting, overwhelmed by the abundance. This wasn't a special delivery. She had seen similar trucks arrive every week since her arrival, sometimes twice a week. The Americans weren't carefully rationing limited supplies or making do with substitutes. They had actual abundance, consistent and reliable. Everything Patterson used in the kitchen, every ingredient that went into their meals and Sunday desserts, came from an apparently endless supply chain that never seemed to falter. Marga joined her at the sink, carrying a basket of potatoes. She followed Liesel's gaze to the unloading truck and went very still. "That's for 1 week?" Her voice was barely audible. Liesel nodded slowly. "Maybe less." Marga set down the potatoes and gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. "We were told America was struggling, that their supply lines were breaking down, that they were nearly defeated." The revelation hung between them, unspoken implications branching out like cracks in ice. Everything they had been told about the war, about enemy weakness and imminent German victory, was contradicted by that single supply truck. If America could feed prisoners this well while fighting a war on 2 fronts, what did that say about German chances of victory? What did it say about all the sacrifices demanded of German citizens in the name of final triumph? Liesel turned back to the vegetables, scrubbing a carrot with unnecessary force. "We were lied to." The words came out flat, factual, carrying the weight of something that couldn't be taken back once spoken aloud. Marga didn't respond, but her silence was agreement. Around them, the kitchen continued its normal operations, but something fundamental had shifted in how they understood their place in the larger story of the war. That evening, Liesel watched more carefully as the American soldiers went about their duties. They didn't move like men facing desperate shortages or imminent defeat. They moved with the casual confidence of people who had never doubted their eventual victory. Their uniforms were intact, their equipment functional, their health robust. Private Rossi had mentioned that his family sent him care packages from Brooklyn. Cookies, magazines, cigarettes. Luxuries that suggested American civilians weren't suffering at all. The chocolate cake on Sunday suddenly meant something different. It wasn't exceptional generosity. It was simply normal abundance extended to include even enemies. They hadn't been given anything special. They had simply been allowed to witness how Americans actually lived. Sergeant Patterson approached Liesel in mid-December with a request that seemed so unusual she wasn't sure she understood correctly. He wanted her to teach the American soldiers how to bake German Christmas cookies. He spoke slowly, using Rossi as translator when her comprehension faltered. The camp was planning a Christmas celebration for all personnel, and Patterson thought traditional German baking might help the prisoners feel less homesick while also educating his American staff. Liesel's first instinct was to refuse. Teaching enemy soldiers to make her grandmother's recipes felt like a betrayal of something sacred. These recipes had been passed down through generations, whispered from mother to daughter in warm kitchens that smelled of cinnamon and butter. How could she share them with people who had bombed her city? But Patterson's expression held no demand, only request. She could refuse without consequence. That freedom to choose made all the difference. She agreed with a hesitant nod, and Patterson's face split into a genuine smile. He immediately began pulling ingredients from the pantry, setting them on the work counter with the enthusiasm of a child. Preparing for a holiday, real butter, white sugar, flour so fine and pure it looked like snow, almonds, vanilla, eggs. Everything she needed was simply available. No rationing or substitutions required. Rossi volunteered as her first student, along with 2 other soldiers whose names she was still learning. Corporal Thomas Green from Kansas, tall and quiet with farmer's hands. Private Michael Chen, who moved with quick efficiency and asked constant questions. They gathered around the work counter while Liesel tried to find English words for techniques she had only ever performed in German. She started with vanilla Kipferl, crescent-shaped cookies that her mother had made every Christmas. Patterson watched from nearby, occasionally helping translate when her English failed. She demonstrated how to cream butter and sugar, her hands moving through motions so familiar they lived in muscle memory. The soldiers attempted to copy her technique, Rossi pressing too hard and creating a lumpy mess, while Green's farmer experience gave him instinctive understanding of proper consistency. As they worked, something unexpected happened. The kitchen filled with warm, familiar smells that transported Liesel backward through time. Suddenly she was 10 years old again, standing on a stool beside her mother in their Munich kitchen, learning these same recipes. Her mother's patient voice guiding her hands. Her father and brothers waiting eagerly to taste the finished cookies. Christmas carols playing softly on the radio. A world where war was something distant, something that happened to other people in other countries. The grief hit her so suddenly she had to turn away, pretending to search for something in the pantry while tears blurred her vision. She pressed her palms against her eyes, breathing slowly until she could compose herself. When she emerged, Green was watching her with understanding that needed no translation. He had lost something too. They all had. These men who seemed so confident and comfortable had their own ghosts haunting them through familiar smells and remembered traditions. On December 19th, Liesel woke to find Frida sitting on her cot, staring at nothing with tears running silently down her face. Today was her 20th birthday. She had turned 19 in a Wehrmacht office in Belgium, where her supervisor had given her an extra cigarette ration as acknowledgement. Now she was turning 20 in an American prison camp, thousands of miles from home, with no idea if her family even knew she was alive. Liesel sat beside her, offering silent company. Words seemed inadequate for the weight of everything Frida had lost: her youth, her country, the future she had imagined for herself. 20 years old should mean celebration, possibility, hope. Instead, it meant marking time in captivity while the world she had known burned to ashes. Other women gathered around, offering what comfort they could. Helene produced a clean handkerchief. Marga squeezed Frida's shoulder. Annalise hummed a soft melody, something their mothers might have sung. That afternoon in the kitchen, Liesel was surprised when Patterson approached with flour, eggs, and sugar. He set them on her work counter with deliberate ceremony, then said a single word she understood perfectly. "Birthday." He pointed toward the barracks, then made a stirring motion. He wanted her to bake a birthday cake for Frida. The request was so unexpected, so impossibly kind, that Liesel couldn't find words in any language. She baked the cake in the hour before dinner, working quickly while other duties continued around her. Patterson had allocated precious ingredients for this, real butter and sugar that could have fed soldiers instead. Rossi helped her mix frosting, his usual cheerfulness subdued as if he understood the gravity of what they were creating. This wasn't just dessert. It was acknowledgement that Frida's life mattered, that her birthday deserved recognition, even in captivity, that she remained human despite being classified as enemy. When dinner ended, Patterson himself carried the cake into the mess hall where the German women still sat at their tables. He set it before Frida, whose eyes went wide with shock. The cake was small, simple, unfrosted, except for basic white icing. But 2 candles flickered on top, their flames dancing in the quiet room. Patterson gestured for Frida to blow them out, demonstrating with pursed lips when she didn't understand. Frida stared at the candles, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. She closed her eyes, and Liesel wondered what she was wishing for. Home? Family? An end to the war? Or perhaps something simpler, like the strength to survive another day, another week, another month of this impossible existence. Frida blew out the candles in one breath, and the mess hall erupted in applause, American soldiers clapping for a German prisoner's birthday. The absurdity and beauty of it struck Liesel with physical force. Patterson cut the cake and distributed pieces to everyone in the hall, German and American alike. They ate together, sharing sweetness that transcended language and nationality and war. For those few minutes, they were simply people acknowledging that a young woman had survived another year in a world trying hard to kill her. Christmas of 1944 approached with complicated emotions. Captain Jennings announced that both German prisoners and American personnel would observe the holiday together with a special meal and limited celebration. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some German women welcomed any acknowledgement of familiar traditions. Others felt that celebrating with their captors bordered on collaboration, a betrayal of soldiers still fighting and dying in Europe. Liesel found herself caught between these positions. She wanted the comfort of familiar rituals, the temporary escape that holiday celebration offered. But she also felt the weight of guilt that had become constant companion. How could she celebrate while her family faced their 5th wartime Christmas under increasingly desperate conditions? Every letter from the Red Cross brought worse news about civilian suffering in Germany. Cities reduced to rubble, food supplies nearly exhausted, children starving in the streets. The contrast between their situations grew more painful with each passing day. In the kitchen, Patterson was preparing a Christmas feast that seemed obscene in its abundance. Turkey, ham, fresh vegetables, real cranberry sauce, pies made with actual fruit and sugar. The menu represented more food than many German families would see in an entire month. Liesel helped prepare these dishes with hands that moved automatically, while her mind wrestled with moral questions that had no good answers. Marga had grown increasingly bitter about their circumstances. She spoke less during meals, worked in silence, avoided eye contact with American soldiers. One evening she confronted Liesel directly in the barracks. "You're becoming too comfortable here. You smile at them. You teach them our recipes. You're forgetting who we are and who they are." Her accusation hung in the air, sharp and painful because it contained truth. Liesel struggled to articulate her own confusion. "I haven't forgotten. But what should I do instead? Refuse to work? Refuse to eat? Hate them because I'm supposed to? They've shown us nothing but basic human decency. Doesn't that deserve recognition?" Marga's response was swift and cutting. "They're the enemy. Decency doesn't change that fact. Our people are dying while we eat chocolate cake and celebrate Christmas with our captors." The argument exposed a fundamental divide among the prisoners. Some, like Marga, clung to their original identity as German soldiers. maintaining emotional distance from Americans despite daily interactions. Others, like Liesel, found themselves changing in ways they couldn't fully control or understand. The kindness shown by Patterson and Rossi and others was reshaping how they thought about enemy and friend, about duty and morality, about the war itself. Helene, overhearing the argument, offered her nurse's perspective. "Both of you are right, and both are wrong. We are prisoners. That's fact. But we're also human beings being treated humanely. Those truths can coexist. The question isn't whether we should accept kindness. The question is what we do with it. Do we let it make us bitter because others don't have it? Or do we let it teach us something about how people should treat each other even in war?" Her words didn't resolve the conflict, but they named it clearly. Christmas Day arrived with unseasonable warmth, the Texas sun bright against blue sky. The mess hall had been decorated with modest paper chains and pine branches that Corporal Green had cut from trees near the camp perimeter. The effect was simple but genuine, an acknowledgement that the day held meaning beyond military routine. Captain Jennings had given both American personnel and German prisoners the afternoon off from regular duties, an unprecedented gesture that recognized the holiday's significance. The Christmas meal exceeded even Liesel's adjusted expectations. Patterson and his kitchen staff had worked since dawn, preparing a feast that belonged in peacetime, not in a prisoner of war camp during the largest conflict in human history. The turkey was golden and fragrant, the stuffing rich with herbs and butter, the vegetables perfectly seasoned. Sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, a bizarre American custom that fascinated the German women. Cranberry sauce that gleamed like jewels, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and dessert. 3 different pies arranged on a separate table. Apple, pumpkin, pecan. Each slice generous, each accompanied by fresh whipped cream. The abundance was almost offensive in its disregard for the suffering that existed beyond the camp's fences. Liesel filled her plate with mechanical precision, her appetite dulled by conflicting emotions. Beside her, Frida ate with obvious enjoyment, guilt apparently set aside for the day. Across the table, Marga picked at her food, her face carefully neutral but her eyes hard. After the meal, something unexpected happened. Private Rossi produced a guitar from somewhere and began playing Christmas carols. His voice was untrained but earnest, carrying melodies that transcended nationality. Silent Night. The song existed in both German and English, a rare bridge between their divided worlds. Rossi sang the first verse in English, his pronunciation careful and clear. Then he paused and gestured toward the German women, inviting them to join. For a long moment, no one moved. The invitation hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. To sing together would be to acknowledge common humanity, to blur the lines that were supposed to separate captor from captive, American from German, victor from defeated. Helene stood first, her voice strong and clear as she began the German lyrics. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. One by one, other German women rose and joined her. Even Marga, after visible internal struggle, added her voice to the growing harmony. The 2 languages wove together, English and German lyrics telling the same story of peace and hope and divine presence. American soldiers began standing, adding their voices to create something that had never existed before in this place. Enemy nationals singing together about a night when heaven touched earth, when angels proclaimed peace to all people regardless of nation or allegiance. Liesel sang with tears streaming down her face. Grief and beauty intertwined so completely she couldn't separate them. When the carol ended, silence filled the mess hall. No one seemed to know what to say or do next. They had created something too pure for war, too hopeful for their circumstances. Captain Jennings finally spoke, her voice thick with emotion. January of 1945 brought news that the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Allied forces were pushing deeper into Germany from both east and west. Cities were falling. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was collapsing after barely 12. In the mess hall, American soldiers listened to radio broadcasts with grim satisfaction. At their separate tables, German women heard the same reports with complicated dread. Victory for the Allies meant defeat for Germany. But what did defeat actually mean for them personally? Rumors began circulating about repatriation procedures. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be returned to their home countries once hostilities ended. But what home would they return to? Letters from Germany, when they arrived at all, painted devastating pictures. Liesl had finally received a response from her mother in late December. The letter was brief, heavily censored, but the desperation bled through every carefully chosen word. Her father was dead, killed in an air raid. Her brother Heinrich was missing, last known fighting on the Eastern Front. Her younger sister Marie was alive but severely malnourished. The apartment they had lived in no longer existed. Sitting in the barracks with that letter in her hands, Liesl understood that the Germany she remembered was gone. Even if the physical place still existed when she returned, the country of her childhood, the world she had known, had been destroyed as completely as if enemy bombs had obliterated it from the map. What awaited her was rubble, starvation, chaos, and judgment from fellow Germans who would see her healthy appearance and comfortable captivity as evidence of betrayal. The Sunday cake tradition continued, but it had taken on different meaning as the war's end approached. What had once seemed like incomprehensible abundance now felt like preparation for goodbye. Liesl watched Patterson serve dessert with his usual quiet efficiency, and realized she would miss this ritual. Not just the cake itself, but what it represented. The routine, the kindness, the weekly reminder that even in captivity, some sweetness remained possible. Private Rossi had been teaching her more complex English during their kitchen shifts. They had moved beyond simple vocabulary to actual conversations. He told her about Brooklyn, about his family's bakery where his father made cannoli and his mother ran the front counter. He described neighborhood festivals and Sunday dinners with extended family crowding around a table barely big enough to hold them all. His affection for home was so evident it hurt to witness. He would return to that world largely unchanged. She would return to ashes and ghosts. One afternoon, Rossi asked her what she planned to do after the war. The question caught her unprepared. She had been so focused on survival, on navigating each day in captivity, that she hadn't allowed herself to think about afterward. What could she plan when she didn't know what would be left to plan for? "I don't know," she admitted in careful English. "My home is gone, my family is scattered. I must start completely new." February brought the first serious discussions about repatriation logistics. Captain Jennings held meetings with the German prisoners, explaining through translators that arrangements were being made for their return to Europe. Processing would take time. Germany was in chaos, transportation systems destroyed, and civilian infrastructure barely functioning. They might remain at Camp Huntsville for several more months before ships could be arranged. The uncertainty was its own form of torture. Liesl found herself spending more time in the kitchen, volunteering for extra shifts even when not assigned. The work provided distraction from thinking about an unknown future. More than that, she had discovered genuine satisfaction in feeding people, in transforming raw ingredients into meals that nourished bodies and occasionally lifted spirits. Patterson had noticed her dedication, trusting her with increasingly complex tasks. She could now prepare entire meals with minimal supervision, her competence earning quiet respect from American soldiers who had initially viewed her as simply enemy prisoner. One morning, Patterson approached her with something she had never seen in the kitchen before. A notebook, small, leather-bound, with blank pages waiting to be filled. He set it on the counter in front of her along with a pencil. "For you," he said clearly. "Write recipes. Take with you." His gesture was unmistakable. He was giving her a way to carry these kitchen lessons back to Germany, to preserve the knowledge she had gained during captivity. Liesl stared at the notebook, emotion tightening her throat. This simple gift represented something profound. Patterson was acknowledging that she had a future beyond these fences, that the skills she had learned here had value, that would outlast the war. He was also giving her permission to take something American back to Germany, to carry evidence of enemy kindness into whatever came next. She opened the notebook that evening and began writing. Not just recipes, though those filled many pages. American measurements translated into German equivalents. Techniques Patterson had taught her for making bread rise higher or pie crust flake perfectly. The proper ratio of sugar to flour for Sunday cakes. But she also wrote other things. Descriptions of the people she had met. The way Rossi laughed while kneading dough. How Corporal Green's quiet competence reminded her of her lost father. Patterson's patient teaching style that never made her feel stupid for not knowing. She wrote about the chocolate cake that had changed everything. How something as simple as dessert on Sunday had forced her to question everything she believed about enemies and allies, about strength and weakness, about what truly mattered in measuring a nation's character. The cake had been more than food. It had been education, revelation, and in its own strange way, liberation from hatred she hadn't known she was carrying. Other women noticed her writing and asked to add their own recipes to the notebook. Helene contributed traditional German dishes from her grandmother. Marga, despite her earlier resistance to American influence, wrote down Patterson's technique for making perfect mashed potatoes. The notebook became a collaborative project, a record of what they had learned and who they had become during this strange captivity. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years finally ended. In the mess hall at Camp Huntsville, American soldiers celebrated with restrained relief rather than wild jubilation. Too many had lost friends and brothers to feel uncomplicated joy. At separate tables, German women sat in stunned silence, processing what defeat meant for their futures and for the families they would soon attempt to find in the ruins of their homeland. Captain Jennings announced that repatriation would begin within weeks. Transportation had been arranged through displaced persons camps in Europe. From there, the women would be processed and released to return to whatever remained of their homes. The news should have brought relief. Freedom, the end of captivity. Instead, most women felt only dread at facing what awaited them across the ocean. Liesl spent her final weeks at Camp Huntsville helping Patterson train his replacement kitchen staff. She moved through familiar tasks with bittersweet awareness that each action might be performed for the last time. This counter, where she had learned to knead bread properly. This oven that had baked countless Sunday cakes. This window where she had watched supply trucks arrive and understood the true scale of American abundance. The kitchen had become more home to her than prison, and leaving it felt like exile rather than liberation. On their last Sunday at camp, Patterson prepared one final dessert, chocolate cake. The same recipe that had greeted them months earlier when they first arrived, confused and suspicious. But this time, as Liesl ate her slice, she understood what she hadn't comprehended before. The cake had never been about chocolate or sugar or American abundance. It had been about dignity, about treating people, even enemies, as if their humanity mattered. About refusing to let war destroy the simple courtesies that separated civilization from barbarism. Private Rossi gave her a gift before she left. A small box containing basic baking supplies, flour, sugar, vanilla extract, chocolate, items that were probably impossible to find in Germany but which he had somehow procured. Along with the supplies came a letter written in his careful handwriting. For when you have a kitchen again, for when you can teach others what you learned here, for when you're ready to believe in sweetness again. She held the box against her chest and couldn't speak around the tightness in her throat. Sergeant Patterson's goodbye was characteristically understated. He shook her hand formally, then pulled her into a brief, awkward hug that conveyed more than words could. "You good cook," he said in his slow drawl. "You good person, remember that. Remember you always have choices about who you want to be." She nodded, memorizing his weathered face, his kind eyes, his farmer's hands that had taught her so much more than cooking techniques. The morning of departure arrived too quickly. 43 German women boarded transport trucks that would take them to the port, then to ships bound for Europe. They carried small bags of possessions and large burdens of uncertainty.